Hi everyone. Today I'm reading another chapter of Global Women, Nannies, Maids, and Sex Workers in the New Economy by Arlie Hochschild. And this chapter is called Just Another Job, The Commodification of Domestic Labor by Bridget Anderson. Paid domestic work looks in many ways like just another undesirable job. The hours are long, the pay is low, and the tasks are often regarded as demeaning. The same could be said of hamburger flipping or garbage collection. But there is much to distinguish the culture of domestic labor from other kinds of low-wage work. Significantly, domestic work is deeply embedded in status relationships, some of them overt, but others less so. And these relationships are all the more complex because they follow along multiple axes. They are relationships among women, but often women of different races or nationalities, certainly of different classes. They take place in a space that can be intimate, loving, and private, but that can also be a form of social plumage, demonstrating to visitors the homeowner's comfort and leisure. And the worker, often a migrant without legal protection or proper papers, may depend on the employer for more than her paycheck, just as the employer depends on the worker for more than her elbow grease. The demand for domestic workers has been steadily rising in Europe, and although one can point to many economic and demographic forces that may have contributed to this trend, the retrenchment of the welfare state, the rise in the ratio of older to younger people, the feminization of the workforce, the rise in divorce, and the decline of the extended family, they leave a good deal unexplained. For instance, many domestic workers are employed by women who do not work outside their homes. Moreover, many paid domestic workers are cleaners rather than carers. While a working couple might need someone to look after their children or elderly relatives, no one has to employ a cleaner in the same way. Iron clothes, dust-gathering ornaments, polished floors, and clean windows are not necessities, but such makers affirm a household status by displaying its access to financial and human resources. The migrant domestic workers I interviewed, many of them through a British support organization called Chilean, seemed to spend much of their time servicing lifestyles that their employers would have found difficult and even undesirable to sustain had they undertaken their upkeep themselves. Said Ada, a Filipino living in Paris, "Every time I clean for my madame, 1 pair of riding shoes, 2 pairs of walking shoes, house shoes. That is every day just for one person, plus the children. That's 1 pair of rubbers and 1 pair of everyday school shoes, 14 pairs of shoes every day. My time is almost finished. You will be wondering why she has so many bathrobes, 1 silk and 2 cotton. I say, why does madame have so many bathrobes? Every day you have to hang them up. Every day you have to press the back because it is crumpled." Siriani, a Sri Lankan living in Athens, recounted, "They have a very big house and white carpet everywhere. They have 3 dogs. I hate those dogs with long, long hair. Even one hair will show up on the carpet." When a cleaner is not enabling her employers to enjoy an extravagant lifestyle or an impractically appointed home, would Siriani's employees have had both white carpet and dogs if they'd had to clean their own home? She allows her middle-class female employer to devote quality time to her children and husband. In effect, employing a cleaner enables middle-class women to take on the feminine role of moral and spiritual support to the family while freeing her of the feminine role of servicer, doer of dirty work. The employment of a paid domestic worker thereby facilitates status reproduction, not only by maintaining status objects, but also by allowing the worker to serve as a foil to the lady of the house. Simply by hiring a domestic worker, the employer lowers the status of the work that the employee does. After all, the employer has better or more lucrative things to do with their time. Many middle-class heterosexual couples in the United Kingdom employ a cleaner once they have children, thereby averting gender and generational conflict over domestic work. But there is no total amount of domestic work that can be divided fairly between equal partners or delegated to someone who is paid to do it. When one does not have to do the work oneself, standards change. Aliska, a Czech au pair in the United Kingdom, recounted, "Her teenage daughter changes her clothes 5-6 times a day and leaves them on the floor. I have to pick them up, wash them, iron them, put them away. I cannot tell her, 'Tasha, you cannot change your clothes so many times,' and my employer does not notice." Economic explanations, then, fail to fully account for the popularity of domestic workers in middle to upper-class European households because they fail to consider the status implications of hiring such workers. Similarly, the prevalence of migrant labor in the sector cannot be attributed only to avoidance of tax and national insurance, for there is a supply of cheap, non-migrant female laborers willing to work off the books. Despite the relatively high wages of Polish workers in Berlin, they still account for a significant proportion of domestic workers. Filipino workers are the most popular in Athens, and they are also the most expensive. Significantly, migrant workers are more willing than local ones to live with their employers. Live-in workers may be considerably less expensive than live-out workers, in some cases because their board and lodging are set against their wages, but especially because employers give more labor and greater flexibility for their money. Whatever hours a live-in nanny and housekeeper is supposed to work, there is virtually no time when she can comfortably refuse to help her employer with a household task. Domestic workers and au pairs commonly complain of having to be available at both ends of the day, early in the morning for children and late at night for entertaining guests. It is a question not simply of long hours, but of permanent availability, said Teresa, a Filipina domestic in Athens. You're working the minute you open your eyes until the minute you close your eyes. You keep your strength in your body going so that you will finish your work. You keep waiting on your employers until they go to sleep because although you finish your work, for example, you finish ironing everything, putting the children or the elder person to bed, even if you put them to bed at 10 o'clock, there are still other members of the family. So you keep on observing, oh, can I sleep? Or maybe will they call me to give them food or to give them a yogurt? And even if you are sleeping, you sometimes feel that you are still on duty. A 1998 survey of 39 Chilean members found that although the workers were well organized and belonged to a trade union, only 18% worked 8 hours or less a day. Nearly 30% averaged more than 12 hours a day. Although the long hours, low pay, and lack of privacy render live-in domestic work extremely unpopular among the population in general, migrants, particularly new arrivals, can find it advantageous. Problems of accommodation and employment are solved in one, and the worker can both minimize expenses and acclimatize herself to a new language and culture. Moreover, housing is more than a place to live. It is a shelter from the police, and many new arrivals are undocumented and terrified of deportation. Employers appreciate live-in migrants because, unlike local domestic workers, migrants cannot leave their employers to go tend to their own sick children or other family obligations. Undocumented workers, in particular, have extremely limited access to their own families or really to any life outside the employing home. Such women, however, isolated in private households without papers or legal protection, are strikingly vulnerable to abuse. Their work can be singularly degrading, cleaning cats' anuses, flushing employers' toilets, scrubbing the floor with a toothbrush 3 times a day, or standing by the door in the same position for hours at a time. One worker told a researcher of a particularly degrading experience. We were 3 Filipinas. She brought us into the room where her guests were. She made us kneel down and slapped each one of us across the face. Sadly, these are not isolated instances. Chilean keeps annual figures detailing the kinds of difficulties faced by the workers they register. In 1996 to 1997, 84% reported psychological abuse, 34% physical abuse, and 10% sexual abuse. Additionally, 54% were locked in, 55% did not have their own beds, and 38% were not fed regularly. Racial stereotypes play a role both in the abuse of domestic workers and in the selection of migrant workers over local citizens in the first place. Certainly, such stereotypes help manufacture a sense of difference between the female employer and her domestic worker. Other women are presumed suited to such service work, and these others are so alien that some employers actually fear that the migrants' bodies will contaminate their homes. Workers are typically required to wash their clothes separately from those of the family, and they are given their own cutlery and plates. Said Rose, a Ghanaian domestic worker in Athens, of her employer's family, the daughter wouldn't even accept water from my hand simply because I am black. Irene, a Filipina I interviewed in Athens, recounted the following story. I heard children playing house. One child said, I am a daddy. The other child said, I'm a mummy. And then she is a Filipina. So what does the child mean? Even the child knows or is already learning that if you are a Filipina, you are a servant inside the house. Agencies and employers tend to express preferences for specific nationalities of domestic workers, and these preferences often reflect racial hierarchies that rank women by precise shades of skin color. One volunteer from Caritas, the International Catholic Social Service and Relief Agency in Athens, told me, the Ethiopians are very sweet. They are not like the Africans who are ugly. Oh my God. Said a worker at an agency in Barcelona, Moroccans are difficult to place. Their religion is very different. They observe Ramadan. They are very different, though like Peruvians, they are brought up to be servile. Filipinas are easiest to place. And according to a community volunteer in Paris, you know the black people are used to being under the sun, and the people in France think they are very lazy. They're not going very quick. And you know another breed, but they are good with children, very maternal. Holy shit. Some hierarchies are based on particular national or personal prejudices. Greek employers and agencies tend to frown upon Albanians and Ukrainians. In Paris, many employers evince a preference for Haitians, who are generally darker skinned than the expressly shunned Moroccans and Algerians. Stereotypes differ across European states, but also across households. One household might display an eccentric liking for Congolese, for example, on the basis of household myths of an almost folkloric character. A bad experience with a domestic worker might lead a family to generalize about her entire nationality. Consider the comments of this Athens employer. I have a problem with women from Ethiopia. They are lazy and they have no sense of duty, though they are good-hearted. I have a lot of experience. I have had 10 girls from Ethiopia. They like to be well-dressed, hair, nails. For that they are good. Then the Albanians, that was terrible. They are liars, always telling lies. And telephone maniacs because they have never had telephones. And they have no knowledge of electronical appliances. For 7 months I had that girl. Then I had one from Bulgaria. The Bulgarians are more civilized, more sincere, more concerned about work, but they are very unhappy. Of course, not all employers are racist or abusive. Some women hire migrants in the hope of helping them. Certainly migrant workers need the money. Why not match the needs of hard-pressed working mothers on the one hand with those of desperate migrants on the other? Many of the domestic workers I met said that traveling abroad had enabled them to make important contributions to their families back home. But most of the more than 4,000 workers at Calayan had never intended to come to Britain. Some had migrated first to the Middle East, from where they accompanied their employers to London on business trips or holidays. Others had taken jobs in their countries of origin and traveled with their employers to the United Kingdom. While domestic workers who had papers felt their work brought benefits to their families, others, especially those still undocumented, found the price too high. Said Nora, a Filipino working in London, my life is worse than before. I'm on this dark road with no way out. That's how I feel. All I want to do is go back home, even though we're very poor. But then, what kind of life will my daughter have? Hidden costs become apparent to many workers when they return home. They often feel ill at ease in their home countries, where things have changed in their absence, and where they may feel that they no longer belong. When their families meet them at the airport, these women commonly do not recognize their own kin. They talk of the embarrassment of having sex with husbands who have become virtual strangers, and of reuniting with children who doubt their mother's love. Often a woman's relatives will have died or moved away. It is thus scarcely surprising that such women are very ambivalent when asked whether they would recommend migration to their daughters. Most migrants would prefer that their daughters did not have to make the choice between hunger and moving abroad. So is employing a migrant domestic worker an act of sisterhood toward a woman in need or of complicity with abusive power structures? Employers often make contact with Calayan after they have seen a television program or read an article exposing the situation of migrant domestic workers in London. They want to help, they explain, and to offer board and lodging in return for help around the house. A place in a British home is proffered as a kind of charity. And the women's labor power is a little extra on the side. But even under the best of circumstances, the employer has power over the worker, and this power is greatly increased when the worker is an undocumented migrant. How the employer chooses to exercise that power is up to her. As Judith Rollins has noted, a kind of maternalism sometimes marks these relationships, wherein friendliness between the women works to confirm the employer's sense of her own kindness and of the worker's childlike inferiority. Through kindness, pity, and charity, the employer asserts her power. Nina, an employer in Athens, had hired dozens of migrant domestic workers to care for her very disabled mother over the years because, she said, this is the Greek way to help foreigners. She claimed to offer exceptional working conditions, though the wages, she told me, were extremely low, and a loving household, but her employees, she lamented, have turned out to be gold diggers. There is no feeling for what I offer. I'll give you an example of the last woman from Bulgaria. I had a bright idea. She needs to see her friends. Because I was tired of all the turnover, I gave her Sunday off. Now, every morning, including Sundays, the girl wakes, helps mother to the toilet, and changes her pamper. Then she goes, but she must be back before 7 p.m. Then, after all I do for her, the girl says every Sunday she would like to be back at midnight and not do any work. That is, not to change the pamper in the morning. This worker was being denied 12 consecutive hours off in a week, an arrangement that would still have placed her hours well above the European legal maximum. Some employers express their maternalism through gifts, giving their domestic workers mostly unwanted cast-off household goods. Said Maggie, a Zairian working in Athens, "You need the money to feed your children, and in place of pay they give you old clothes. I give you this, I give you this. They give you things, but me, I need the money. Why? I am a human being." All of these exercises of power, whether through direct abuse, through the insistence that a worker perform degrading tasks, or through acts of maternalism, expose the relationship between worker and employer as something other than a straightforward contractual one. But that is not the only relationship in the domestic workplace that is fraught with ambiguity and complexity. When we hire someone to care for children or the elderly, we cannot pay simply for the physical labor of care, leaving the emotional labor to those who are genetically linked to those cared for. Magnolia, a Dominican nanny in Barcelona, noted, "Sometimes when they say to me that I should give her lots of love, I feel like saying, well, for my family I give love free, and I'm not discriminating, but if it's a job, you'll have to pay me." Indeed, many parents hire nannies rather than sending their children to daycare precisely because they want their children to develop personal, emotional relationships with the people who care for them. But can the emotional labor of care really be bought? The worker may carry out the physical work of care, entering into a sort of intimacy with the children, but her caring engenders no mutual obligations, no entry into a community, and no real human relationship, just money. A worker may care for a child over many years, spending many more hours with that child than the child's natural mother does, but should the employer decide to terminate the relationship, the worker will have no further right to see the child. As far as the employer is concerned, money expresses the full extent of her obligation to the worker. To the worker, this view is deeply problematic. Indeed, it denies the worker's humanity and the very depth of her feelings. Juliette, a nanny from Côte d'Ivoire, working in Parma, recalled, "I cared for a baby for his first year. The child loves you as a mother, but the mother was jealous and I was sent away. I was so depressed then, seriously depressed. All I wanted was to go back and see him. I will never care for a baby again. It hurts too much." The idea that the worker can be considered part of the family allows some employers to negotiate these difficulties. Interestingly, this language even appears in UK immigration legislation with reference to au pairs. But the analogy does not withstand scrutiny. A relative who contracts a long-term illness is not expelled from the family. Domestic workers usually are, even if they are given a nice severance package. And although being a part of the family does not entitle the worker to unconditional love or support, it does entitle the employer to encroach on the worker's off-duty hours for favors. In fact, many employers will invoke either a contractual or a family relationship under different circumstances, depending on what is most convenient. Writes Miranda Miles, "The disadvantage of being one of the family far outweighed the advantages. Wages tended to be lower and erratically paid on the premise that the maid would understand their financial situation. Incorporating a domestic worker into the family circle is usually, although not always, a sure way of depressing wages and possibly hiding even the most discreet forms of exploitation involved in the employer-employee relationship." These are vexed questions for while informality clearly leaves workers open to exploitation, excessive hours for instance, or low pay, workers also value having personal relationships with their employers, particularly because domestic work can be highly isolating. In some cases, a woman will decide to work for low wages precisely because she feels that a particular family is nice or an employer treats me as part of the family. Professionalizing employment relations and rendering them more anonymous may therefore introduce new difficulties. Labor is a social, not simply an economic process. This is not to say that the labor contracts for domestic work are not important. We should welcome the emergence of domestic labor into the realm of recognized and productive work. Professionalization is a means of giving respect to domestic workers, as well as of managing the personal relationships that develop from care work. Certainly, it is possible to argue for the social significance of care work. Changing an elderly person's incontinence pads is surely as important and as deserving of social respect and status as the work of a stockbroker. But the work of cleaners and housekeepers sometimes occupies a more problematic space. Cleaning can be part and parcel of caring, and tidying up for a disabled person, for instance, can be construed as socially valuable. But many cleaners, like those described at the start of this essay, do work that simply expresses the employer's status, leisure, and power. Can such race, class, and gender-based divisions be resolved through contracts? Undocumented migrants, for example, cannot draw boundaries or refuse work they find demeaning. They simply do not have the power. The most effective way to protect them is to make sure they have the basic employment rights, as well as access to the means to implement those rights. For migrants, these rights begin with work permits. Because both the workers and the employers in this sector tend to be women, it is tempting to draw on notions of sisterhood in order to reform the relationships between employers and employees. But the power relations among these women are very complex, to the point where even acts of kindness work to reproduce an employer's status and self-image, and they do not always, in the end, benefit the worker. This does not mean that employers should not respect their domestic workers, but rather that they should also be aware that the very act of employing a domestic worker weaves them into a status relationship. Real sisterhood, then, should take concerned women beyond their own homes. It means campaigning and organizing around issues of migration and domestic labor, having as an important first demand that domestic work be treated in the best sense like just another job. And that is the end of that chapter. Thanks for joining me. Bye.